The autumn of 1987 brought with it the kind of cold that settles into old bones and refuses to leave. In Salem County, where the mist clings to forgotten valleys and the past seems always present, the estate sale at Fenhollow Manor drew little attention from the outside world. The local newspaper ran a modest advertisement, 3 lines buried between notices for farm equipment and church socials. Yet for those who understood the weight of certain names, the dissolution of the Fenhollow estate marked the end of something that had endured far longer than most could remember. Margaret Thorne arrived at the manor that morning not as a collector of antiques, but as a keeper of local histories. Her work with the Salem County Historical Society had trained her eye to recognize the stories hidden within abandoned possessions, the narratives that objects carry long after their owners have passed into memory. The manor itself stood as a monument to decay. 3 stories of Victorian grandeur slowly surrendering to time, its gabled roofs sagging under the weight of too many winters, its wraparound porch listing like a ship taking on water. The estate sale sprawled across the manor's interior like the contents of a life turned inside out. Furniture that had once commanded respect now bore the indignity of price tags and curious fingers. Crystal decanters caught the pale morning light, casting fractured rainbows across walls where wallpaper peeled in long, deliberate strips. The air carried the particular scent of abandonment, dust and old wood, lavender sachets turned bitter with age, and something else, something deeper that seemed to rise from the very foundations of the house. It was in the manor's grand parlor, beneath a water-stained ceiling that had once hosted elaborate social gatherings, that Margaret first encountered the portraits. 7 paintings in total, ranging from 4 family compositions to intimate individual studies, each bearing the hallmarks of skilled 19th century artistry. The frames, though tarnished, spoke of considerable expense, and the subjects, men, women, and children dressed in the fashions of different decades, gazed out with the kind of composed dignity that money could buy. Yet something in their expressions troubled her. Perhaps it was the way their eyes seemed to follow movement across the room, or the subtle tension that played at the corners of their mouths, as though each subject harbored some private knowledge they were forbidden to share. The estate sale clerk, a nervous woman who kept glancing toward the darker corners of the house, quoted a price that seemed almost apologetic in its modesty. "Family portraits," she explained, her voice barely rising above a whisper, "though I'm not certain anyone local would want them. The Fenhollows, well, they kept to themselves for so long that most folks have forgotten them entirely." Margaret purchased the collection without hesitation, drawn by an instinct she had learned to trust during her years of historical research. As the portraits were loaded into her vehicle, she noticed how the moving men seemed eager to complete their task, how they avoided looking directly at the painted faces, how the autumn air seemed to grow colder in their presence. The last portrait loaded was that of a young girl, perhaps 7 years old, dressed in white lace with flowers in her dark hair. Her eyes held a sadness that seemed far too mature for her years, and Margaret found herself wondering what story had shaped such premature sorrow. The drive back to her cottage was unremarkable, yet she found her thoughts returning again and again to the portraits now secured in her car's interior. There was something about them that defied easy categorization, a quality that went beyond mere artistic merit or historical value. They seemed to carry with them the weight of untold stories, of secrets carefully preserved beneath layers of oil paint and varnish. As she pulled into her driveway, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across her yard, Margaret felt the peculiar sensation that she had not simply acquired a collection of paintings, but had inherited a responsibility she did not yet understand. That evening, as she arranged the portraits in her study, Margaret began the careful process of cataloging her acquisition. Each painting would require research, identification of subjects, dating of techniques, investigation into the artists who had created them. Yet as she examined them more closely under the warm glow of her desk lamp, she began to notice details that had escaped her attention during the hurried chaos of the estate sale. Subtle inconsistencies in the brushwork, areas where the paint seemed thicker than necessary, places where careful examination suggested layers beneath the visible surface. It was while studying the portrait of the young girl that Margaret made her first discovery. Angling the painting to catch the light from different directions, she noticed what appeared to be the faint outline of another face beneath the child's painted features, older, more angular, with eyes that seemed to hold a different kind of knowledge entirely. The discovery sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the autumn evening settling around her cottage. The restoration of old paintings required patience above all else. Patience and a willingness to accept that some secrets reveal themselves only to those prepared to look carefully enough. Margaret had converted her cottage's back room into a makeshift conservation workshop, where controlled lighting and proper ventilation allowed for the delicate work of uncovering hidden truths. Over the following weeks, she applied herself to the portraits with the methodical precision of an archaeologist, using solvents and careful scraping techniques to reveal what lay beneath decades of accumulated varnish and overpaint. What she discovered defied logical explanation. Each portrait contained not one image but two, the visible subject painted over an earlier different face entirely. The hidden visages were uniformly older, bearing expressions of what could only be described as watchful malevolence. Where the surface portraits showed the expected range of human emotion, contentment, dignity, the natural variations of family resemblance, the concealed faces shared a commonality that troubled Margaret's sleep and haunted her waking thoughts. The breakthrough came while examining the largest portrait, a formal family grouping that had hung above the manor's main staircase. As Margaret carefully removed layers of darkened varnish from the background, her tools revealed the edge of what appeared to be carved wood rather than painted canvas. Further investigation disclosed a hidden compartment built directly into the frame itself, so cunningly concealed that it had escaped notice for over a century. Within this compartment lay a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellow with age but remarkably well preserved. The cover bore no title, only the initials CF, stamped in gold, that had long since tarnished to brown. Opening to the first page, Margaret found herself reading the meticulous handwriting of Cornelius Fenhollow, dated June 15, 1847. The boundary has been established, and the arrangement sanctified. What follows must be wrong. Accorded, though I pray these words never find their way to unworthy eyes. The early entries detailed the Fenhollow family's arrival in Salem County with a specificity that suggested guilt rather than mere record-keeping. Cornelius wrote of purchasing their land from those who possessed incomplete understanding of its true nature, of negotiations conducted in the manner prescribed by older authorities than church or state. References to the necessary preparations and the watchers in the walls appeared with increasing frequency as the entries progressed, accompanied by crude diagrams that resembled architectural blueprints for rooms that did not appear in any surviving plans of the manor. Margaret found herself drawn into Cornelius's narrative, despite its increasingly disturbing implications. His prose carried the cadence of a man attempting to justify actions that defied justification, of someone constructing elaborate rationalizations for choices that haunted his conscience. "The children understand," he wrote in an entry dated October 31, 1847, "for they see more clearly than we who have allowed ourselves to be blinded by the false comforts of adulthood. They know the watchers, speak with them in languages that predate words. It is not cruelty but necessity that requires their participation." The marginalia proved even more unsettling than the text itself. Strange symbols appeared throughout the ledger, geometric patterns that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally, arrangements of lines and curves that suggested meaning without offering comprehension. Alongside these mysterious markings, Cornelius had sketched faces that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the hidden visages Margaret had discovered beneath the portrait's surface paint. The drawings showed the same watching eyes, the same expression of patient malevolence, as though he had been documenting the appearance of actual subjects rather than products of imagination. As autumn deepened into winter, Margaret found her research expanding beyond the ledger's contents into the official records of Salem County. Birth certificates, death records, property deeds, and census data began to reveal a pattern that the Fenhollow family's own documentation had only hinted at. The public record showed a family that had indeed prospered in the decades following their arrival, acquiring additional properties and establishing themselves as pillars of local society. Yet there were inconsistencies, gaps in the documentation that suggested careful editing of the historical record. The most troubling discovery came while cross-referencing census data with the family portraits. Children appeared in the painted record who seemed to vanish entirely from official documentation after their 7th birthday. only to reappear as adults decades later with no intervening trace of their existence. When Margaret attempted to reconcile these discrepancies with church records and school enrollments, she found that many documents from the relevant period had been damaged by a convenient fire in 1923, leaving only fragments and reconstructed copies that raised more questions than they answered. Cornelius's final entries for 1847 spoke of completion, of a covenant established in perpetuity, and of obligations accepted by those who must follow. His handwriting, previously neat and controlled, became increasingly erratic as he described the awakening of the arrangement and the first harvest of understanding. The last entry for that year consisted of a single sentence, repeated 7 times in increasingly shaky script. The boundary holds, but only with willing guardians. Margaret closed the ledger as winter's first snow began to fall outside her cottage windows, understanding that she had uncovered only the beginning of a story that extended far beyond a single year or even a single generation. The portraits watched from their positions around her study, their hidden faces now impossible to ignore, their painted eyes seeming to track her movements with an awareness that no mere pigment and canvas should possess. The Salem County Historical Society occupied a brick building that had once served as the town's original courthouse, its archives stretching back to the county's founding in 1798. Margaret had spent countless hours in these basement storerooms, but never with the focused intensity that now drove her research into the Fenhollow family's documented history. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she worked through boxes of records that most scholars had dismissed as too fragmentary to yield meaningful insights. The pattern emerged slowly, requiring cross-references between sources that had never been intended to be read together. Church baptismal records showed Fenhollow children born in regular intervals across multiple generations. Healthy infants welcomed into congregations with the appropriate ceremonial observances. School enrollment documents confirmed their attendance at local educational institutions, though teachers' notes often described these children as unusually mature or possessed of an unsettling gravity uncommon to their years. Yet after age 7, the children simply vanished from the documentary record. No death certificates, no transfer notices to other schools, no marriage licenses or professional certifications in later years. It was as though they had simply ceased to exist at the precise moment childhood gave way to something else. When Margaret attempted to trace their disappearances through newspapers, per accounts or coroner reports, she found only silence, a deliberate absence of information that suggested either remarkable carelessness or systematic concealment. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source. The reminiscences of elderly residents recorded by the Historical Society in the 1970s as part of an oral history project. Among dozens of interviews with longtime Salem County families, Margaret discovered references to the Fenhollow children that had been dismissed as folklore by previous researchers. Mrs. Adelaide Morse, interviewed at age 93 in 1976, spoke with startling clarity about her childhood memories of the manor and its inhabitants. "Oh, the Fenhollow children," Mrs. Morse had told her interviewer, her voice carrying the particular authority of advanced age. "Strange little things, always standing at the garden gate when we'd walk past after church. Never seemed to grow any bigger, year after year. My mother used to hurry us along when we passed their place, said there were things about that family that decent folks didn't discuss. But children notice things adults pretend not to see. And I can tell you those little ones were always watching, always waiting for something." Further interviews revealed similar accounts. Children who appeared to remain unchanged across decades, who were seen in the manor's garden well into the 20th century despite official records suggesting the family line had ended. Thomas Whitmore, recorded in 1974, described encountering a group of Fenhollow children during his own childhood in the 1920s. Couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, any of them. But they spoke like grown-ups, asked me questions about my family, about whether my parents loved me enough to keep me safe. Something in their voices made my skin crawl, like they were testing me for something I didn't understand. The most disturbing account came from Eleanor Hastings, whose family had briefly worked as servants at the manor during the 1930s. Her interview, conducted just months before her death in 1977, provided details that subsequent researchers had found too fantastical to include in serious historical analysis. Yet Margaret, armed with Cornelius's ledger and her growing understanding of the family's true nature, recognized the consistency beneath Eleanor's seemingly impossible claims. Mother worked as a housekeeper there for 3 months before she couldn't stand it anymore, Eleanor had whispered to her interviewer, as though the very walls might be listening. She'd tell me about the sounds that came from the basement at night, children singing, but not like children should sing, not happy songs, but something older, something that made her stomach turn. And the portraits. She said they watched her while she cleaned, that she could feel their eyes following her from room to room. Eleanor's account included details about midnight ceremonies witnessed through basement windows, where children in white clothing gathered around what she described as paintings that moved like windows into somewhere else. Her mother had reported seeing figures emerge from the portraits themselves, not the subjects painted on their surfaces, but the older faces hidden beneath, taking physical form to walk among the assembled children. Mother said they were teaching them something, Eleanor continued, preparing them for some kind of changing. She quit the next morning and never spoke of it again, except to warn me never to go near that place after dark. Margaret spent weeks verifying these accounts against available records, searching for corroborating evidence that might support what seemed impossible. What she found instead was a systematic pattern of erasure, documents that had been removed from public files, newspaper archives with pages carefully cut out, official records that had been altered or destroyed in the same 1923 fire that had claimed so many other inconvenient truths. The most compelling evidence came from an unexpected source: photographs. While researching unrelated local history, Margaret discovered a collection of amateur photographs taken by a traveling salesman who had visited Salem County regularly throughout the early 1900s. Among his documenting of local businesses and town events were several distant shots of the Fenhollow Manor, taken from the public road that passed by the property. In photograph after photograph spanning nearly 3 decades, the same group of children appeared in the manor's garden. Their clothing changed with the fashions of different years, but their faces remained constant. 7 children who never aged, never grew, never changed except for the increasing intensity of their watchful gazes. The final photograph in the sequence, dated 1934, showed the children arranged in a semicircle around what appeared to be an 8th figure, a child whose face had been deliberately obscured by damage to the photographic plate, as though something had actively resisted being captured by the camera's lens. Margaret studied these photographs until her eyes ached, using magnifying glasses and enhanced lighting to extract every possible detail. The children's expressions held the same quality she had observed in the painted portraits, an awareness that seemed to extend beyond their apparent years, a knowledge of things that innocent minds should never contain. In several images, they appeared to be looking directly at the camera despite being photographed from considerable distance, their gazes carrying across decades to meet Margaret's own eyes with an intensity that made her close the albums and step away. The final piece of this particular puzzle came from the most recent sources Margaret could locate: interviews with social workers and county officials from the 1960s, when the last official Fenhollow heir had died without issue. These professional accounts, recorded for administrative purposes rather than historical preservation, contained references to ongoing concerns about the manor property that extended well beyond typical inheritance disputes. Even after the family was gone, wrote County Supervisor James Morrison in 1963, we continued to receive reports about activity at the property. Neighbors complained about lights in the windows, voices in the garden, children playing where no children should be. Local law enforcement investigated multiple times but never found evidence of trespassers or squatters. Eventually, we stopped responding to calls about the place. Some properties, it seems, generate their own mysteries. These official dismissals only strengthened Margaret's growing conviction that the Fenhollow children had never truly disappeared. They had simply been transformed into something that existed beyond the reach of conventional documentation. The portraits in her study seemed to confirm this possibility, their hidden faces watching with impatience that suggested not death, but a different kind of existence entirely. Winter's grip on Salem County tightened as Margaret delved deeper into Cornelius Fenhollow's ledger, working by lamplight as the days grew short and the nights stretched long around her cottage. The ledger's middle sections revealed the true scope of what Cornelius had set in motion during those first crucial months after his family's arrival. What she discovered there challenged not only her understanding of local history, but her conception of what was possible within the rational world she had always trusted to provide explanations. The entries from 1848 onward abandoned any pretense of conventional record-keeping, instead documenting a correspondence with entities that Cornelius referred to as the older residents. His handwriting had evolved from the careful script of a businessman to something more urgent, more desperate, as though he were racing to complete some vital communication before time ran out. "They have made their requirements known," he wrote in February of 1848, "and I have accepted the terms, though the price weighs heavy upon my soul. The prosperity they offer is real, as is the protection they provide, but the boundary they maintain demands constant feeding." Margaret found herself returning to this concept of the boundary repeatedly, as Cornelius's references to it grew more specific and more disturbing. It appeared to be some kind of barrier that prevented the older residents from expanding beyond the limits of the Fenhollow property, a containment that required regular reinforcement through what he euphemistically termed voluntary participation. The children born to each generation were not merely offspring, but essential components of a mechanism designed to maintain this supernatural imprisonment. The ritualistic aspects of the arrangement were documented with clinical precision that made them all the more horrifying. Cornelius described ceremonies conducted in the manor's basement, where the portraits served as gateways between the visible world and whatever realm the entities inhabited. "The children must be prepared gradually," he explained in an entry dated March 15, 1848, "for the transition requires willing souls rather than mere vessels. They speak with the residents through the painted eyes, learning the languages of watching and waiting until the boundary between child and guardian becomes meaningless." Archaeological evidence supported these impossible claims. Margaret had arranged for ground-penetrating radar examination of the manor's foundation, ostensibly as part of a historical preservation survey. The results revealed chambers beneath the basement that did not appear in any architectural plans, spaces arranged in the same geometric patterns that appeared throughout Cornelius's marginalia. When she convinced local authorities to allow limited excavation, citing concerns about structural integrity, the discoveries confirmed her worst fears. The bones were arranged with ceremonial precision, 7 small skeletons in each chamber, positioned around central focal points where the portraits had apparently been displayed during the transformation rituals. Carbon dating confirmed that the remains spanned multiple generations, from the mid-19th century through the early 20th century. Each set of remains showing evidence of peaceful death rather than violence. These children had not been murdered in any conventional sense, but had undergone some process that preserved their essential selves while transforming their physical forms. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the forensic anthropologist who examined the remains, provided Margaret with a confidential report that raised more questions than it answered. "The bone structure shows no signs of trauma or disease," Dr. Chen wrote. "But there are anomalies that I've never encountered in 30 years of practice. The calcium composition includes mineral traces that don't occur naturally in this region, and the bones themselves show a crystalline structure that suggests some kind of preservation process. Most disturbing are the cranial modifications, not surgical alterations but changes that appear to have occurred during the final stages of life, as though the children's skulls were adapting to accommodate something beyond normal brain dev." The elopement. The portraits themselves began to manifest changes as Margaret's investigation progressed. The hidden faces became increasingly visible without chemical treatment, as though her growing understanding of their true nature was somehow strengthening their ability to present themselves. The painted eyes tracked movement with undeniable awareness, and the cottage's temperature seemed to drop whenever Margaret spent extended time studying them in her converted workshop. Cornelius's later entries described the progression of each 7-year cycle with matter-of-fact acceptance that suggested either complete madness or terrible enlightenment. "Young Martha has begun to show the signs," he wrote in 1855, referring to what Margaret assumed was his daughter. "Her eyes hold the depth that comes with seeing beyond the veil, and her conversations with the painted ones grow longer each night. She asks questions about the nature of watching, about whether love can exist without flesh, about why some boundaries must be maintained regardless of cost. I know that she understands what awaits her, and I believe she accepts it willingly. The transformation process, as Cornelius described it, was gradual rather than sudden. Children selected for participation spent months or years in communication with the entities trapped within the portraits, learning to perceive reality from their perspective, gradually accepting the role of guardian rather than victim. They do not die, Cornelius insisted in multiple entries, but rather expand beyond the limitations of singular existence. Through the portraits, they become part of something larger, something that serves the greater good by maintaining the boundary that protects all others from what lies beyond. Margaret struggled to reconcile these claims with her rational worldview, yet the evidence continued to accumulate. Local records showed that the Fenhollow family had indeed prospered in ways that defied normal explanation. Their investments always successful, their harvests never failing, their members living longer and healthier lives than statistical probability should have allowed. This prosperity had extended to the broader community as well, with Salem County experiencing unprecedented growth and stability during the decades when the arrangement was most active. The price of this supernatural blessing became clear through Cornelius's increasingly frantic later entries. Each generation was required to provide 7 children to maintain the boundary, and as the family line dwindled in the 20th century, the burden became impossible to sustain. "The residents grow restless," he wrote in what appeared to be his final entry, dated 1923. "The boundary weakens without sufficient guardians, and I fear what may emerge if the arrangement fails entirely. I have hidden the knowledge where it may be found by one capable of understanding, praying that Providence will provide a solution when the bloodline can no longer fulfill its obligations." The 1923 fire that had destroyed so many official records now took on new significance. Margaret realized that it had been deliberately set to conceal evidence of the arrangement's failure. Occurring in the same year that Cornelius's ledger entries ceased, the Fenhollow family had lasted another 40 years, but without the willing participation of 7 children per generation, the supernatural protection had begun to fade. As Margaret closed the ledger for the evening, she found herself staring at the portraits with new understanding. The children painted on their surfaces had been real once, had played in gardens and attended school and had possessed the normal hopes and dreams of young lives. Yet somewhere in their 7th year, they had been given a choice that no child should face: to accept transformation into something beyond human existence in order to protect humanity from forces it could never comprehend. The cottage grew cold as she considered the implications of her discovery, and Margaret pulled her shawl tighter as she prepared for another sleepless night, haunted by painted eyes that watched with the patience of eternity. Spring arrived late in Salem County that year, as though winter itself was reluctant to relinquish its hold on the landscape where such dark secrets lay buried. Margaret had spent the intervening months in a state of careful contemplation, recognizing that her investigation had reached a threshold beyond which her role would fundamentally change. The portraits had become her constant companions, their presence both comforting and deeply unsettling as she worked to understand the full implications of what the Fenhollow family had maintained for over a century. The discovery that would alter everything came during what Margaret had intended as a final visit to the manor before spring cleaning began on the property. The county had listed the building for demolition, citing structural concerns and the cost of historical preservation, but she had obtained permission for one last survey of any remaining artifacts that might hold historical value. It was while examining the manor's attic spaces, areas that previous investigations had deemed too dangerous to explore thoroughly, that she found the final piece of the puzzle. Hidden behind a false wall that had escaped notice during earlier inspections, Margaret discovered a small chamber that appeared to have been used as an artist's studio. Easels covered with dust sheets occupied the space, along with dried palettes and brushes that had waited decades for hands that would never return. But it was the single uncompleted portrait that dominated the room, a painting that stopped Margaret's heart and confirmed her worst fears about the true nature of her involvement with the Fenhollow legacy. The portrait showed herself, captured with photographic accuracy despite being painted by someone who should never have seen her face. Every detail was perfect, from the arrangement of her silver hair to the particular way she held her head when concentrating on difficult research. Yet it was not the Margaret of the present, but rather the Margaret she might become, older, more careworn, with eyes that held the same quality of watchful patience she had observed in the hidden faces of the other portraits. The painting was signed CF 1962, indicating that Cornelius, or something using his identity, had continued working long after official records showed his death. Beside the easel, Margaret found a collection of sketches that documented her own activities with unsettling precision. Her first visit to the estate sale, her work in restoring the portraits, her research in the Historical Society's archives. The dates on these drawings preceded her actual actions by months or years, suggesting that her involvement had been anticipated and carefully orchestrated from the beginning. A letter addressed to the coming keeper lay folded beside the portrait, written in the same hand that had filled Cornelius's ledger but bearing a date from just 3 years earlier. Margaret's hands trembled as she read words that had been written specifically for her discovery. The boundary weakens with each passing year, and the residents grow restless in their confinement. The bloodline that sustained the arrangement for so long has failed, but Providence has provided another solution. You have been chosen not by chance, but by necessity, for you possess the knowledge and the dedication required to maintain what others would allow to collapse. The letter continued with explanations that filled in gaps Margaret had struggled to understand. Her career as a local historian, her particular expertise in 19th century family records, even her residence in the cottage that provided clear sightlines to the manor, all had been arranged through subtle influences extending across decades. The entity or entities that had made the original arrangement with Cornelius possessed the ability to manipulate probability and circumstance, gradually shaping events to ensure that someone suitable would eventually inherit their burden. The portraits were never merely paintings, the letter explained, but windows between realms, gateways that allow the residents to observe without emerging. The children who served as guardians did not die, but rather learned to exist simultaneously in both worlds, maintaining their watch from within the painted boundaries. You have already begun this transition, though you may not yet recognize the changes taking place within your own consciousness. Margaret realized with growing horror that the letter's claims were accurate. Her dreams had indeed changed over the months since acquiring the portraits, filled with visions of chambers beneath chambers, of entities that existed as pure observation, of children who spoke in languages that predated human speech. She had attributed these experiences to stress and overwork, but now understood them as preparation for a role she had never chosen but could not refuse. The most disturbing revelation concerned the nature of the boundary itself. Rather than being a simple barrier, it represented a complex agreement between dimensions of reality that human minds were not equipped to fully comprehend. The entities confined within the portraits were not malevolent in any traditional sense, but rather represented forms of consciousness so alien that their unrestricted presence would drive most humans to madness. The children who served as guardians were not victims but rather bridges between incompatible forms of existence, their transformed consciousness allowing communication and containment that pure human awareness could never achieve. You will not be asked to sacrifice children as previous generations did, the letter continued, for you bring different gifts to the arrangement. Your knowledge of history, your ability to preserve and protect information, your isolation from the broader community. These qualities make you suitable for a guardian role that requires no transformation of innocence. The children who watch from within the portraits will teach you what you need to know, will guide you in maintaining the boundary through scholarship rather than sacrifice. As Margaret finished reading, she became aware that the portraits in her cottage were no longer simply objects in her possession, but rather components of a surveillance system that extended across miles and decades. Through their painted eyes, the guardian children observed the manor's condition, monitored the strength of the supernatural containment, and evaluated potential successors to their vigil. She had not discovered the Fenhollow family's secret. She had been recruited by it. The final section of the letter offered what might have been comfort or threat depending on perspective. The choice remains yours, as it must for the arrangement to function properly. You may walk away, destroy the portraits, allow the boundary to collapse and face whatever consequences emerge, or you may accept the role that has been prepared for you, becoming the keeper of knowledge that protects not only Salem County but the wider world from truths it cannot bear. The children who watch will not judge your decision, but they will remember it, as they remember all things that matter to the maintenance of necessary boundaries. Margaret set the letter aside and looked around the hidden studio, understanding that she had reached the moment that every previous generation of Fenhollows had faced, the moment when comfortable ignorance gave way to terrible responsibility. Outside the manor's windows, spring was finally asserting itself over winter's reluctance, but inside this concealed chamber, time seemed suspended in permanent twilight. She thought of her quiet cottage, her peaceful retirement, her plans for simple historical research that would trouble no one and threaten nothing. Then she thought of the painted children whose sacrifice had maintained peace for over a century, of the entities whose alien consciousness required constant vigilance to prevent catastrophic contact with unprepared human minds. The choice was hers, but she already knew what her answer would be. The weeks following Margaret's discovery in the manor's hidden studio passed in a strange suspension of normal time, as though the very act of accepting her new understanding had shifted her existence into a different relationship with reality. She had returned to her cottage carrying not only the final portrait but also the crushing awareness of what her life was about to become. The painting now occupied a place of honor in her study, positioned where its unfinished features could observe her daily activities with the same patient attention as the completed works. Margaret's journal from this period, written in careful longhand during the sleepless hours that had become her new normal, documented the gradual transformation of her consciousness as she accepted the role that had been prepared for her. "I understand now why Cornelius wrote so extensively," she noted on April 15th. "The act of recording these experiences serves not only as documentation, but as a kind of anchor to what we once considered reality. Without these written words, I fear I might lose myself entirely in the expanded awareness that comes with seeing the world as the residents see it." The changes were subtle at first, an increased sensitivity to sounds that had no visible source, a growing awareness of movement in peripheral vision that revealed nothing when examined directly. The cottage itself seemed to respond to her new status, with rooms appearing larger than their actual dimensions and shadows falling in patterns that defied the position of external light sources. Margaret found herself spending hours in conversation with the portraits, initially speaking aloud to what she assumed were painted images, but gradually realizing that responses were coming back through whispers that might have been wind through old walls or might have been something else entirely. The painted children proved to be patient teachers, sharing their knowledge through dreams and intuitive insights rather than direct communication. Margaret learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated weakening in the supernatural boundary. Fluctuations in the manor's electromagnetic field, changes in local animal behavior, variations in weather patterns that followed no meteorological logic. She discovered that her role as keeper required not only vigilance but active maintenance through rituals that she initially approached with scientific skepticism but gradually accepted as necessary. Procedures. "The boundary is not a wall," she wrote in late April, but rather a complex system of checks and balances that requires constant adjustment. The residents test its strength regularly, not out of malevolence but from a natural desire to expand beyond their confinement. "My task is to reinforce their containment through acts of recognition and acknowledgement, to see them clearly enough that they feel observed, but never so completely that they gain sufficient power to emerge." The most challenging aspect of her new role was the isolation it required. Margaret had always been a private person, but the knowledge she now carried could not be shared with anyone who lacked the proper preparation. When concerned friends called to check on her welfare, she found herself offering reassurances that felt increasingly hollow. When historical society colleagues invited her to present her research on the Fenhollow family, she declined with excuses that grew more elaborate and less believable over time. Her journal entries from May revealed the depth of loneliness that came with being the sole keeper of such profound secrets. "I understand now why the previous guardians chose children for this burden. Young minds adapt more easily to impossible truths, while adult consciousness fights against accepting realities that threaten established worldviews. I find myself mourning not only for my former ignorance, but for the simple human connections that are no longer possible when every conversation must be carefully edited to exclude the central truth of one's existence." Yet alongside the isolation came a strange kind of purpose that Margaret had never experienced in her previous scholarly work. Her research took on new urgency as she documented not only the Fenhollow family's history, but also the broader patterns of supernatural containment that existed throughout human civilization. She discovered references to similar arrangements in dozens of cultures across multiple continents, suggesting that the boundary between human reality and alien consciousness required vigilant maintenance in many locations worldwide. "We are not alone in this vigil," she wrote in early June, and perhaps that knowledge provides some comfort. Across the globe there are others who have accepted similar responsibilities, who maintain barriers that protect the majority from truths they are not equipped to process. We are the watchers who allow others to sleep peacefully, the guardians who bear witness to dangers that must remain invisible to function effectively. The portraits themselves had become more than mere surveillance tools. They now served as Margaret's primary companions and counselors. The painted children shared memories of their previous lives alongside lessons about their current existence, offering glimpses of what it meant to exist simultaneously in multiple states of being. Through these communications, Margaret began to understand that her own transformation would be gradual rather than sudden, that she was becoming something new, while retaining essential elements of her humanity. Her final journal entry from this period, dated June 21st on the summer solstice, captured both the weight of her burden and her growing acceptance of its necessity. "Today marks 6 months since I first encountered the portraits, and I can see clearly how much has changed. I am no longer the simple historian who sought to preserve local family records, but neat. Have I become something entirely alien to my former self. I exist now in the space between these identities, serving as a bridge between the world of ordinary human experience and the realm of ancient watchfulness that the residents inhabit. The loneliness is profound, but so is the sense of participating in something far greater than individual existence. Tonight I will complete the ritual preparations that will formalize my acceptance of the keeper's role, knowing that there is no path back to ignorance, only forward into deeper understanding of why some knowledge must be guarded by solitary souls." The transformation from reluctant discoverer to willing guardian was completed during the summer solstice of that year, in a ceremony that Margaret conducted alone in her cottage study, while the portraits watched with their eternal patience. She had found the ritual instructions hidden within the final pages of Cornelius's ledger, written in a cipher that had taken weeks to decode but which revealed procedures that felt both ancient and inevitable once understood. The ceremony itself was simple in its execution, but profound in its implications. By candlelight, Margaret spoke the words that formally accepted her role as keeper of the boundary, acknowledging her understanding of the responsibilities that would define the remainder of her existence. As she completed the final phrases, written in a language that predated any human tongue she recognized, the cottage filled with a presence that was neither threatening nor comforting, but simply immense, a consciousness so vast that her individual awareness seemed like a single star in an infinite night sky. In the months that followed, Margaret established the routines that would sustain both her sanity and her vigilance. Each morning began with a careful inspection of the portraits, noting any changes in the hidden faces that might indicate fluctuations in the supernatural containment. She learned to recognize the subtle variations in their expressions that served as communication, a slight narrowing of painted eyes that warned of testing probes from the confined entities, a barely perceptible shift in mouth position that indicated successful reinforcement of weakened barriers. Her cottage became a monitoring station disguised as a simple retirement home, equipped with instruments that appeared to measure nothing more threatening than humidity and temperature, but which actually tracked the electromagnetic signatures that indicated supernatural activity. The local utility company, responding to her complaints about irregular power fluctuations, installed recording equipment that Margaret secretly modified to document the energy patterns associated with attempts to breach the boundary. The manor itself required regular visits, though Margaret was careful to schedule these during daylight hours when the entity's influence was naturally weakened. She maintained the building's physical structure not out of historical preservation instincts, but because the architectural elements served essential functions in the containment system. Load-bearing walls aligned with geometric patterns that channeled and directed supernatural forces, while specific rooms served as amplification chambers that strengthened the barriers between dimensions. Margaret's journal from this period documented the peculiar mixture of mundane maintenance and cosmic responsibility that defined her new existence. Replaced 3 broken windows in the manor's east wing today, not for aesthetic reasons, but because use intact glass is essential for maintaining the optical elements of the containment array. The entities exist partially as pure observation, and any interruption in the sight lines between key positions weakens their ability to remain focused on their confined space rather than the world beyond. The isolation that had initially troubled her gradually transformed into a different kind of companionship. The painted children became her advisors and confidants, sharing not only practical knowledge about maintaining the boundary, but also deeper insights into the nature of sacrifice and duty. Through their whispered guidance, Margaret learned to interpret the signs that indicated when the contained entities were testing their limits, and how to respond with the appropriate combination of acknowledgement and denial. "They do not truly wish to escape," she wrote in her journal during the autumn of her first year as keeper. "Their testing is more like a conversation, a way of confirming that someone still watches, still maintains the agreement that protects both sides from the consequences of unrestricted contact. They are as aware as we are that their emergence would destroy the delicate balance that allows both forms of consciousness to coexist in relative peace." The broader world continued around her, with Salem County experiencing the normal rhythms of small-town life while remaining unaware of the vigilance that protected their comfortable ignorance. Margaret attended town meetings and church services, maintaining the social connections that prevented unwanted attention, all while carrying knowledge that would shatter the sanity of anyone unprepared to receive it. She became expert at the kind of double consciousness that allowed her to function in ordinary human society while remaining constantly alert to signs of supernatural disturbance. Her most challenging moments came when well-meaning friends expressed concern about her increasing reclusiveness, her reluctance to travel beyond the county limits, her growing tendency to spend hours staring at old paintings that seemed to hold an unhealthy fascination for her. Margaret learned to deflect these concerns with carefully crafted explanations about her research, her health, her simple preference for solitude. All technically true, but concealing the profound truth that her presence was literally essential for maintaining the safety of everyone around her. The weight of this responsibility was most apparent during the winter months, when the supernatural forces seemed stronger and the boundary required more active maintenance. Margaret spent long nights conducting the rituals that reinforced the containment, speaking words and languages that hurt her throat while arranging objects in patterns that her rational mind insisted were meaningless, but which her deeper understanding recognized as absolutely essential. "The loneliness is not punishment," she reflected in a journal entry from her second winter as keeper, "but rather a necessary condition for the work. Human emotional connections, however beautiful, create vulnerabilities that the entities can exploit. By accepting isolation, I become less susceptible to manipulation, less likely to make decisions based on personal attachment rather than cosmic necessity." The painted children understand this balance between duty and desire, having long ago transcended the limitations of individual will. Yet even as she accepted the solitude required by her role, Margaret found unexpected sources of satisfaction in her vigilance. The knowledge that her daily routines protected thousands of innocent people from exposure to consciousness, shattering truths, provided a sense of purpose that her previous scholarly work had not ever achieved. She was no longer simply documenting history, but actively participating in the maintenance of the boundary between safety and chaos. Her final journal entry before settling into the permanent routine of her keepership captured both the melancholy and the strange peace that had come to define her existence. 3 years have passed since I first acquired the portraits, and I can no longer imagine life without this responsibility. The woman who once sought simple answers to historical questions has become someone who guards questions too dangerous to ask. In accepting this transformation, I have lost the comfortable illusions that once defined human happiness, but gained something perhaps more valuable: the certainty that my life serves a purpose greater than personal satisfaction. The painted children watch with approval, and in their eternal patience, I find the strength to continue the vigil that protects the world from truths it cannot bear to know. The seasons turned around Margaret's cottage, each cycle bringing subtle changes to her understanding of her role while reinforcing the fundamental constancy of her duty. She was no longer counting days or months, but rather measuring time in the rhythm of rituals, the patterns of supernatural activity, the gradual deepening of her communion with the forces she both served and contained. In the end, Margaret Thorne had become exactly what the arrangement required: a guardian who understood that some stories never truly end, but simply find new keepers willing to carry their weight through all the years that follow. The boundary held, as it had for over a century, maintained by the watchful sacrifice of those who chose knowledge over comfort, duty over desire, and the protection of others over the preservation of their own peace. And in her study, surrounded by portraits whose painted eyes reflected depths of understanding that no ordinary canvas should contain, Margaret continued her vigil, alone but not abandoned, burdened but not broken, serving as the bridge between the human world's comfortable ignorance and the terrible wisdom that watched from just beyond the edges of everyday sight.